I wasn't always into this creation stuff. I didn't know that you could hold this kind of view. And I still remember what happened. One weekend, there was a conference like this when I was living out in Iowa. And this speaker came to town and challenged us to consider the idea of a recent supernatural creation. That's how everything got started. And I thought, where's that guy from? The 1800s? It sounds like something so old and outdated. But it's not outdated. It makes good sense. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, this whole creation worldview. By the way, this talk is going to be a little bit interactive, and you're going to have to help me. At some point, everybody's going to need a feather. So I've got, these are all duck feathers, actually. They've been colored. So if you could just kind of grab one out of there, the color doesn't matter, and pass them on. In a few minutes, everybody's going to need a feather. I've also got some little scraps of paper here. Everyone's going to need one of these. So this is kind of like a reverse offering. You can take something out of the basket. Take one of these when they come. My goodness.
We can pass this one around and we can take some of that.
I do appreciate Michigan State allowing us to come onto campus and do a seminar here on a quiet Saturday. You got some good folks here in administration controlling the whole thing. Well, this is going to be the title of our talk, Discovery of Design. It's just kind of a current interest of mine, and I think you'll find it interesting as well. It just touches on this whole area of origin, how everything got started. But even before I do that, how about a quick commercial? There are some different organizations around the country that are kind of pushing this creation worldview, and here's one of them. Have you heard of the Creation Research Society? Well, you've heard of it now. This is actually the oldest creation group in the country. It's been around 50-some years. This group keeps a low profile, but it's a society that you join for men and women, people who are interested in this whole creation view, that evolution's not enough, that there's a master designer behind it all. This society has about 1,700 members worldwide, scientists, mathematicians, but then just us regular people as well. Anybody can join the society. And it's kind of a neat group. We produce a technical journal. It's called the CRS Quarterly. It comes out 4 times a year. We got 50 years of that stuff, quite a stack. When you get into this creation area, that doesn't mean you just close the books and go home and say, God did it, that's the end. No, this area opens up whole new areas to explore that nobody else thought of. So there is research to be done. We also publish a more popular reading magazine called Creation Matters, and we have a newsletter. We publish books. There's some good books in this whole area of this topic we're on. We have funds. We have an endowment, so we fund research. We accept grants for creation research. As we go through the day, you'll catch on to what some projects are. We have a laboratory that we operate out near the Grand Canyon in Arizona, where visiting scientists can stop and stay there a few days if they're doing research on desert plants or on the Colorado River or whatever. There's our website, creationresearch.org. I'm just part of that group, and I appreciate what they're doing. There are several other groups around the country. Some have a higher profile, like those museum people down in Kentucky, AIG. Actually, we do the research, and we give it to those folks, and they publicize it and get the credit. But we all work together. We're all kind of cousin organizations. So let me just say a little bit more about the CRS. If you're interested, I've got some brochures here. And maybe I won't pass these out, but if you want one, I'll just have them here. They kind of tell a little bit about this organization. And actually, we have some free memberships right now for students. We found some other donors that are welcome to subscribe for people. So you might try this out for a year or two, see if you gain something from the Creation Research Society. It's a great organization, 50-some years. I appreciate the pioneers who kind of started that whole group. We just wanted to have a refreshing way to look at science, and anyway, it goes on. So that's the end of our little commercial, the CRS. Back to this title for our talk here, Discovery of Design. What is this thing all about? Well, when it comes to design, of course, there's lots of that in nature. My world is not biology, but here's an owl, butterfly, who's got a wing that kind of mimics maybe the eye of an owl. Maybe that would keep predators away, make him a little bit more safe. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in nature. Amazing what we have out there. Well, this word mimicry has sort of been modified today, and it's called the study of biomimicry. This is a hot topic. In fact, there are whole journals on that word. And this is what I mentioned here at the start of our session this morning. Inventors, engineers, science labs, they're realizing that there's lots of ideas out there in nature for new products, solutions to problems, wherever you are, even in the nano world. And so they're looking to nature for useful ideas. And so kind of mimicking nature, I guess that's what that top word is. They also call it bio-inspiration, getting ideas from the great out-of-doors. We're going to look at a few of those this morning. And the bottom line is these things don't happen on their own. They go right back to the beginning of when this world started. And just to tell you where I'm coming from, I think that there is a creator. And he loaded up this world with endless ideas, practical ideas for us to find and make use of just for our well-being. And one by one we're discovering these ideas. Most of them are still out there in nature. But anyway, we're going to look at some of these, and maybe toward the end you have some more suggestions for me, because I'm kind of gathering a whole reservoir of these designs from nature. So we're going to start, and I've got a bunch of these things, and they're kind of fun to think about. Remember the good old summertime in the backyard, catching these lightning bugs? Now, that's interesting little critters. And, you know, if you catch them, let them go, unless they hit the windshield of your car. How do those things work? No battery, no light bulb, and yet they turn the lights off and on. Well, of course, these have been studied by the biologists and realized that these little critters, from the food that they eat, they make two chemicals. In fact, they've named them. There's luciferin and luciferase. And they keep these chemicals separate. And when you mix them together, it makes a chemical light, kind of a cool light, and the lights come on. We're not sure how they can blink them off and on and all that, but that's what they do. Well, can we learn something from that? Can we gain from it? These days, we can make those chemicals, luciferin and luciferase, and you can buy it in the stores. And they put them in these little tubes like this. I see there's, these chemicals are kept separate. There's a little glass container there. And you know what I got here, a light stick, kind of thing the kids like for their bracelets and necklaces running around at night. And so to get this thing going, I got to mix these chemicals. So you break it and shake it up. And my goodness, the lights come on. So anyway, if we have a power failure here now, we'll have a little night light here this morning. Just put that right in here. You know, these things are very useful. For fishing or for backpacking. They're making some bright ones now that are replacing the flares that we used to have on the highway. They make those things by the billion. And where does that idea come from? By studying fireflies. One of these ideas from nature. Now they've learned other ways to do this, and there are lots of creatures in the sea as well that you know, kind of make these chemical lights. Anyway, I kind of watched the literature for these things where they're talking about it. And this is actually 14 years ago, New Scientist, that's a British magazine. They titled it First Light, how by studying these bugs we come up with these interesting lights, ideas from nature, and how useful those things are. Now the trouble is, those fireflies can last at least a couple of weeks. These go off after a couple of hours. We haven't quite caught up with the bugs yet. And they've been trying to come up with different colors for these dyes as they work on it. So we're going to look at a few of these designs from nature, and that's our first one. Now let's go underwater. A lobster. Interesting creature. Here he is in salt water, and they live often in shallow water. They have eyes, so I guess there's enough light down there they can see. The eye of a lobster is not like ours. It doesn't have a typical lens like we have, or it doesn't even have the multiple lenses like some insects have. Instead, the eye of the lobster is very interesting. And I was trying to catch another picture of it here. Those electron microscope pictures at the top of this slide. Its eye is actually rectangular boxes or openings. And the inside of those boxes are silver. So it's like a mirror inside these boxes. And so the picture on the far right here, when light enters there, it kind of ricochets back and forth off the sides to get down where the sensors are so it can see. That's how it operates. It looks like it also has multiple boxes. I was trying to think how this works, and so I took 4 mirrors and I kind of taped them together. So this would be a large economy size rectangle like is in that top right hand picture. And I can look through it, it's kind of shiny in there. It always reminds me kind of like a kaleidoscope. Anyway, I brought some things here, and I'm going to kind of pass them around, or you can look at them afterward anyway. But kind of a, you know, an analogy to this eye of the lobster. Now the thing is, there's something we can learn from this. There are lots of different kinds of light, as we know. There's visible light, there's infrared, there's ultraviolet, and there are X-rays, which are a form of invisible light. I mean, anything that travels at the speed c. And so these days, we're getting X-rays from space, and we want to be able to focus those so we can study them. That gives us more information about space. But how do you focus X-rays? A glass lens doesn't work very well. By studying this kind of rectangle, and with X-rays, it's realized that when X-rays come in at a glancing angle like this, they do reflect off. So they put this thing together, and these days they're making X-ray telescopes, and they are duplicating this eye of the lobster. I'm not sure if the idea originated there, or if they just kind of put it together, and the lobster's now seeing X-rays. But this kind of optics works for them. And so we have the lobster eye telescope. In fact, there are several of these. These are up in space. These are satellites that are using this kind of system to collect X-rays. One more part of the whole spectrum of light from space. A lobster helping us to design satellites. You know, what next? Design from nature. It's just kind of fun to think about. I was just going to wrap that up with this picture. There's this Femur galaxy, and you can look at something like this with different wavelengths, different kinds of light. And the one at the bottom there is infrared light. That's more like heat. And the one in the middle is visible light, the Roy G. Biv thing that we're familiar with, from red to violet. And then up on top is an X-ray picture, the kind they're getting with these lobster eye telescopes, which shows the galaxy material is more spread out. And anyway, you put all those things together and it gives you lots more information. We're looking at some designs from nature, and they just kind of keep coming. And another way to say this, it's intelligent design. You've heard that phrase before, and there's plenty of that, and we're looking at some of it. So while we're under the water there, talking about that lobster, here, let me grab another one. Now this is, what is this thing? Anybody identify it?
Squid.
These things get 2 or 3 feet long. Kind of looks like a squid, kind of related to the squid, but it's something a little different. It's, it's a cuttlefish.
Oh, good call.
Now this is salt water. They live all over the planet. Interesting critter. It does have those filaments on it, so it can kind of scoop through the water. Well, now why would I put this on our list of designs from nature? This cuttlefish is a master of design, of camouflage. It can change color in an instant. When it's swimming above pink coral, it turns pink. When it's up by green seaweed, it turns green. And it can do this very quickly. A master of disguise. There's an upper picture of it. Looks like it's just by some gray and brown coral. I don't know what he's doing in that lower picture. I think he's just showing off, you know, just the colors that he can present. Well, what we've learned is that this thing has actually little reflective mirrors under its skin that can reflect what's around it. And it also can change dyes. There's some chemical things going on there to change colors as well. Changing color, camouflage in an instant. What would be the interest here? Who might want to study this? How about the Pentagon?
Yeah, military.
The military, where they're trying to keep safe our guys and gals who are in harm's way. And so these things are being studied for a new generation of, you know, camouflage for military clothing. And this all becomes rather secret. I don't know what they're doing, but of course they're always ahead of what we know. But they're able now to make fabrics that can change their color with the surroundings so that you just about disappear. Or paint on a vehicle that can make it come and go. There's another article. There's been more updated articles, but these are just from my archive. Another one from 2000. Cuttlefish stay in the skin. Just being amazed at how these things can vary their color. Ideas from nature. Oh, I got a quick one here. The dolphin. See anything we can learn from these guys? The intelligent design, the way these things are all made, as well as them being rather smart. Well, we all know how those things can zip through the water. So one fellow jumped on this and patented a new kind of swim fin. Not 2 single ones like you might have used before, but a monofin. I think it'd be a little hard to come out of the water with that thing. You'd have to crawl up on the shoreline. But once you get into the water, what they're finding out is you can swim like a dolphin with these things. And these guys and gals who do this can actually come up and jump right out of the water with these things. They can get that much speed going. I want to pick up one of these things. I'm from across state over there in Grand Rapids. We like Lake Michigan. We like the state parks, and it can be kind of fun in our Great Lakes in the summertime. Here's a gal. Looks like there's a few different designs of these monofins. The idea got by looking at dolphins and how they get around. And I was reading articles about this. It says very little effort. You kind of twist your body like the dolphin does. And one guy's planning to swim across the ocean with one of these. Lots of luck there. I think you better start with the English Channel or something. But amazing to duplicate what these creatures have done. Designs from nature. Let's see, we had the Firefly, then we had a couple under the water, and they're going to keep coming at us here. Let's think of flight. Now that's a whole world, by studying the birds. We've learned about airplanes and lots of other details like that. So here's a parrot. And thinking of design, could you take the feather that we passed around? Could we get one of those? Again, these are all duck feathers. I found them in a craft part of a store. Boy, very lightweight. No wonder these things can fly. But here's our little activity on a Saturday morning. If you could just kind of hold this thing up like this. What we need to do is take this side and pull down on it and kind of wreck it. And when you do that, if you listen close, you can hear a little click as it opens up. In fact, let's do both sides. Just mess that feather up on a Saturday. Birds will do this sometime when they're preening their feathers, kind of cleaning them up, pulling them apart. So you're with me that far, but now we got to finish this up. Can you put it back together again by stroking upward on the sides? And this may take a little bit multiple ones, but yeah, you can get it back together again, I think. And then you can pull it apart. You can put it back together. This reminds us of something on a Saturday morning. Kids on their shoes or their jackets, they have that fastener, stick it together, pull it apart. Starts with a V. Oh, I don't have any more hints. Velcro. Now, Velcro was discovered in nature by an Englishman. He actually saw a cockleburr sticking to his dog's fur. He took a walk in the woods. Maybe it was in November or whatever. And then when he got back home, he was studying this cockleburr and saw that it has little hooks on it that grab each other, and they'll spring apart or you can get them back. And that's the same thing a feather has. So again, I didn't say that he invented it. He found it in nature. And this is another form of Velcro that's been there ever since the birds were made. We think that the birds showed up on day number 5 of the creation week, by the way. So Velcro. That's probably a classic example of the discovery of design in nature. Very useful design. There's a cockleburr on top, and there's a close-up microscope picture. Of course, they make Velcro these days out of nylon. I guess that's a close-up of the cockleburr. Those close-up pictures are fascinating to look at. So anyway, you can keep that thing for a bookmark. Memory of our workshop today here on design in nature. I found out, by the way, watch out, if that feather gets wet, the color comes off. I don't know what kind of dye that is, but it's good as long as it's dry with us for now. So all of a sudden we left the water world behind and we're looking at things like birds. While we're there, let me show you our next example. If you are keeping track, by the way, I think I have about 18 examples altogether in our time, and we're just kind of knocking them off here. And the ideas are actually countless. These are some of my favorites. So here we have a kingfisher bird. Now some of you are into birds, might be familiar with this one. It lives in Michigan, all around the world really. It's the craziest looking bird. It has a small body and a big oversized head. It looks like a committee designed it or something, and got put together strange. It's got that big beak on it. But there's something that this bird is capable of. He'll sit up on a branch, water below him, and when he sees a minnow go by, straight down to the water he goes to get his lunch. He'll snatch the minnow. And when it does that, it makes very little splash. It just slips right into the water and then slips out again. No splash. It ought to be in the Olympics, where they give credit for not a lot of debris splash. So anyway, that's what this kingfisher does. Now, that's his property, but I keep trying to look at a practical use, a solution to a problem. And so this story goes on. It involves the country of Japan, where they have interesting railroads. They have high-speed trains. They call them bullet trains. We don't have anything like that in this country yet. Thinking about it, but we'll see. These bullet trains travel 200 miles an hour. They're very safe, but there's a problem. Japan also has mountains, and when you're going that fast, you got to go through the mountain rather than over it. So they build these tunnels for these high-speed tracks. They have found out that when one of these trains is going through the tunnel, a cushion of air builds up in front of it, and when the train exits the tunnel, that air rapidly expands and causes what's called a sonic boom. It sounds like thunder. It wakes people up. It rattles windows for miles around. It's not a good thing. Japan is real big on pollution, even sound problems. And so something had to be done to address this, this issue of train noise when they exited tunnels. Now, one of the guys who, the team that designs trains, one of them apparently was into birds and was familiar with this kingfisher and the way this thing can slip into water, and thought, you know, there's a similarity. This thing going from air into water, huge pressure difference, somewhat similar to a train leaving a tunnel. And so they went to work and redesigned the front end of these trains, and they mimic the shape of the head of the kingfisher bird. They have this real long tapered front end, and I got a kick out of these pictures here. They've even copied the nostril of the bird with the headlights that they have. What they find out now is that when these kind of trains leave the tunnel, there's no sound. It just slips in and out. And they also save 10 or 20% of their total energy. Learning to design high-speed trains by studying how the kingfisher was designed in the first place. See where I'm going with this? It is intelligent design. We're surrounded with these ideas, even in a world that's no longer perfect. You can see how this whole thing was set up for our well-being and for our practical help here in new products, solutions, and on it goes. Okay, ready for the next one? I want to keep it going here so we don't get bored. Back in time, this one, this is a fossil. This little critter, they've only found one fossil of these. It was over in Kyrgyzstan. And this little flying reptile is only about 20 centimeters long, so, I don't know, 7, 8 inches. So it's a small little thing. And they have found the bones, and then they draw this artist's picture of what he might have looked like. That's the picture there on the left. So, you know, flying reptiles, just like marine reptiles. We had those things around back in the old days. But there's something interesting about this one, and it has like a double wing. And the drawings show that better over on this side where it's got these little flaps. In flight, those are called canards. And they're wondering, is that kind of strange how this stuff evolved by chance? How did it end up with that membrane on the front of his bones? But they've done modeling of this sort of thing in wind tunnels and find out that that is very useful. In fact, some airplanes, they're actually copying that. I'm not sure whose plane, I think that's a model plane there on the right. But can you see the little 4 wings there on the top? When they do that, they find out that they can land at a much lower speed, so they need to have a shorter runway, you know, solving megabucks for that kind of thing. Now, this is an interesting example because we're making use of the design of a fossil to better design aircraft. Everything that I'm saying here, lightning, bugs, the birds, it's typically said that, sure, these things look like they're designed because they've been fine-tuned over millions of years. Mutations and natural selection change critters, and then the ones that have some kind of value, you know, they live on and the rest of them die out. This is the common story of how we get to where we are today. But that idea of mutations and natural selection doesn't work for this critter, because this is a fossil. This thing is said to be 250 million years old when he lived. That would be the early days of flight, and yet he had that advanced type of design at the beginning. And this is really what we're finding, folks, when we look at the fossils. None of them are simple or primitive. Anything that was alive, where the living cell had more complexity than we can imagine. And we're looking at a lot of the fossils to find intricate designs to help us even with modern ideas. So that was one challenge there, that things just happen over time, given enough time. This one hasn't had enough time. It's been there since the beginning. And by the way, I'm one of these radical creationists. I don't think that this world, that this old cosmos is as old as they say anyway, but that's a separate topic, and it's a fun one, an important one, but we'll go on here. Now we're going to look at something real small. You heard of these diatoms? Probably the most common fossil on the planet. These things are microscopic. These are electron microscope pictures. They live in the soil. They live in fresh water, salt water. They just about float through the air. They're so small. So these are little things. And we can't decide whether they're plants or animals or something in between, but there they are. Now, these little critters, they live in glass houses. That's what these pictures are. Somehow they synthesize quartz, SiO2, from nature, from whatever they're eating, and they build these interesting shapes. And of course, there's thousands of these different, I guess you'd call them different species of diatoms. Now, they've been known for a long time, and look at that one on the left here, kind of star-shaped, very symmetrical. When they got into these things 100 years ago with microscopes, the people used to have contests to see how many of these they could mount on one microscope slide. And they have these classic slides that are kind of artistic now. I'm thinking if you were doing this, you wouldn't want to sneeze during this process. You got these little tweezers and you're moving these diatoms around. It's interesting what they've come up with. I don't know if anybody's doing that anymore, but there's just a whole bunch of them. Well, I'm trying to find them practical uses. And again, I think that's the way nature was set up for us. So what can you do with these little things? I mean, there's just so many. They even put them in cement as sort of a binder. But there's something else you can do. When you look at these diatoms closely, it's amazing. Some have a whole bunch of little openings, like a sieve or a strainer. Other ones have an outside edge that looks like a gear. That's the dark blue one there. Now, I put another word on this slide, nanotechnology. You know the word nano, 10 to the minus 9? This is the big area in physics today, making things that are really small. You know, they can make pumps, they can make motors, they can make valves that are so small you can't see them. I mean, they're like dust size. And of course, the medical world's interested in that. Perhaps we can send those things internally and they can fix on your insides, you know, and then flush it out of there somehow. Anyway, a whole lot of work going on in very small scale, complex machinery, nanotechnology. Well, I'm looking at these pictures here. There may be some use for a sieve on that scale. Diatoms are there waiting for us, at least their shell, their skeleton. Some of these little motors need gears. That one over there looks like a man-made gear, not man-made, but ready to be used. So they're looking at these things as building blocks for nano machinery. Now these are rather fragile. They're just SiO2 quartz. What they do is they take these things and they call it sputtering. You can layer those with metal. You can put a metal skin on them, which makes them harder and more permanent. So in that way you can transform them into something fragile, into something permanent. Well, we've been looking at several different areas. We had flight, we had things in the water. This is kind of the micro scale. So just jumping around all around, they're kind of fun things to see what we are surrounded by. Here's another kind of different one. Let's talk about slime mold on a Saturday morning. Maybe you've seen this before if you go walking in the woods, or maybe even if your backyard. If you have a log, a piece of wood that's decaying, sometimes this stuff will form. Again, this stuff, I think it's a bunch of amoeba, and again, whether it's plants or animals, something in between, it's kind of alive. Probably doesn't have a brain, but here it is. It's actually multiple little critters in there. So you have this moldy stuff that grows. I remember seeing some kind of orange brown color on a log in our backyard. So it's just there, kind of colorful. Well, is there anything we can do with this? Everything has lessons for us as we're studying this whole area of biomimicry. So an experiment was done with this slime mold. Now this again goes back to Japan. They seem to be leaders in this whole area of coming up with new ideas. Let me show you what they did. Start with just that upper left-hand picture. They took a big sheet of plywood, 4x8, and on it they drew a map of part of Japan. Okay, so that's here, yeah, it says 0 HR, 0 hours. And then those little white dots were little bits of food that this slime mold likes. I think it was little bits of oat flakes. And then putting the little dots where the cities are in Japan. So this is a big map here, miles and miles. And the yellow was a little blob of this slime mold. I think that's probably in Tokyo there. So they got this thing set up. Here's this map, here's these different food spots, and then they turn the lights out because these things work better in the dark to see what would happen. And over the next 5, 8, 12, 11 hours, you can see that what this slime mold does is it sends out tendrils looking for food. And when it can't find any, it pulls back. And when it finds better than another place, it'll kind of put its tendrils together. So this thing grew. Again, I'm not sure what the scale is, how many inches or feet this was, but it looks like in 26 hours, when they finally got to studying this thing, they found out that this original slime mold had these trails, these tendrils, all over the place connecting these food sources. And they got to looking at this more closely and found out that it matches quite precisely the rail system of Japan. This thing was minimizing the distance between all of these connections here. It's not so dumb after all. It was minimizing the amount of energy that it needed to get at these food sources. So they kind of modeled this mathematically. This gets into algorithms that gets beyond us on a Saturday morning. But they're using this program by copying this slime mold to design communications networks and travel new highways. As this continues in this country, if they put in a new highway across the U.S., it may have been designed by slime mold originally, which was showing them the best way to go. I'll tell you, this is amazing as this goes on and on, and most of the things are still all around us. We haven't found them. Those who are inventors seem to have the eye to come up with these ideas. Well, that was slime mold. What are we up to? Number 9? I forget again how many I have, but we're marching through. Here, let me get back to something more macroscopic again. The beech tree. Well, that's kind of popular around the Midwest. And there's a leaf. I guess they've all fallen off here with the wind and fall season we've had. The beech leaf is kind of interesting. In the spring, 6 months from now, as the trees bud out, the whole leaf forms. You got the whole leaf, but it's all kind of folded up inside a pod. And then one day the pod splits and the whole leaf unfolds, and there it is. And I can just see that rib structure, you know, like leaves have. And in fact, these green things that I passed around here, could you pick one of those up here? This is my homemade attempt to make a beech leaf. First, it's all kind of you know, rolled up flat inside a pod, and then one day the pod splits and the leaf opens up. Can you make yours kind of open up? I thought maybe we should try to fold these, but that gets to be a bit of a chore. So anyway, that's kind of how it works. And you can fold it up or unfold it in a hurry. Folding in nature, that's another area of design. Of course, butterfly wings fold up in different kinds of plants. So this is the beech leaf. Is there anything we can learn from this? That's an interesting, looks like an accordion, the way that thing folds. Well, this has captured the interest of the space program. You know, when we get these satellites up in orbit, they need to have these solar panels spread out to collect sunlight for energy, but how do you get them up there? They got to be folded up and then those go into a rocket. And so some of these satellites, they are using this folding mechanism, and it gets up there, and then they unfold it. This, back to Japan again, this is one of their satellites, and it doesn't show it very well in the artist's drawing, but the one down there in the corner kind of shows a close-up of some of that solar panel where they were using this kind of mechanism. So now we're using leaves off a neighborhood tree to help us design components of space vehicles, design in nature. And again, we kind of rule out that idea of mutations and natural selection. These things go back as far as we can see into the fossil record, and they're just there. Yep, other satellites as well. That's just one example. And while we're in the plants, after the beech tree, I just got to mention Indiana corn. Of course, you've got a lot of corn here in Michigan as well, here in the Midwest, the flatlands. And so this picture on the left-hand side shows a little shoot of corn that's been pulled right out of the ground. You can see the root system and the leaves. What has been found is that on a sunny spring day, sunlight hits the top of this corn shoot and goes right down to the stem and goes underground. And if you could see underneath the soil, it's lit up. It actually conducts visible light underground. And then there are some light-sensitive enzymes down there that can make use of it. That's how it gets energy to grow, along with the moisture and the soil nutrients. It's using sunlight. Now, of course, we have a name for that, sending light down through a corn shoot or through a fiber optics. And that's really with us today. Email goes around either wireless or on fiber optics. In fact, I see they're burying fiber optics all over the country now. It's just kind of replacing other kinds of wires. And so that's kind of a neat idea from nature, fiber optics. I brought some of this stuff along here. This is a piece of this. Kind of looks like fishing line. And let's try this out just to see if it works here a minute. Could you help me here? Could you just kind of hold that? We're going to watch the end of it. I got about 20 feet of this stuff here, fiber optics. And I have a laser. Let's see this. I got a couple. Let's see which one is the brightest here. Let's go with this one. Now what I'm going to do is shine a laser light to this end and see if it'll go all the way through this fiber and come out that end, because it's supposed to. You get what's called total internal reflection. There's lots going on there. Tell you what, just to make this more complicated, let me tie this in a knot. What do you think? Can we get the light to go through there now?
Yeah.
Well, if this was a hose laying in your backyard, you know, a garden hose, could you shine a flashlight in one end and get light to come out the other end?
No.
I don't think so. I haven't tried it, but I don't think it'll work. But this is fiber optics. So if we could watch the end that he's holding. Let me just get this here. Yeah. You know, if this was spread clear across the Michigan State campus, the light would come out that end. If this is good stuff, 100% of the light goes through. In fact, if it was clear across Michigan, the light would come out. Now, in real fiber optics, they don't even use visible light. They're probably using infrared, but it's the same principle. So, yeah, fiber optics. And you can put, you know, information, you can put energy on these things as well. So they continue to work this stuff and improve it, modify it. And to come up with better fiber optics, what's one thing they're looking at? Corn, which is a natural fiber optics. Of course, other planes do that as well, little bean sprouts and things, but they're conducting light through their system. And again, with that physics idea, total internal reflection, there's lots going on, even with corn. Here's one more from the plant world. Now, this is in the desert area, over there in the Middle East. Not much grows other than, you know, cacti, hot and dry. But what they noticed is that there was one plant that just seemed out of place. In fact, it looks rather luxuriant. It has a big green leaf. Looks like it has a little red flower in the middle. And they're thinking, what's that thing doing in the desert? How can it survive? Especially the leaf structure. And I can see it has all the little ridges in it, the peaks and valleys. And it turns out that all those things are carefully made. Of course, it's the DNA that grows this thing. So that in the morning, when the dew comes, when there's some moisture in the air, it hits that leaf and runs down those little valleys, down those little rivulets, all to the middle of the plant to water it. So it's like this thing is actually gathering water from more distant places. That's a couple of feet in size. It's just a great water gatherer. So over there in Israel, they've copied this thing, and they can grow crops in the desert now, even without irrigation. It looks like those are plants going down the middle there. And they put these plastic containers around with these ridges. They say they got this idea by looking at this desert rhubarb, and it waters itself. Well, they may still be trickling water on it with that little tube going across the top as well. But anyway, they're saying that this thing gathers much more water than it should in the desert because it's got such a big surface area gathering whatever moisture there is in the atmosphere. There are some things in the desert that look like they're out of place, and it's doing just fine. Oh, I had to kind of come up with another old one here. Remember that thing from Kyrgyzstan, that flying reptile? Because I don't want to leave out the things from days gone by. So here we have an Ankylosaur. This is the one with the big club on its tail. Remember when you're a kid, you learn all these dinosaurs? About as big as a school bus. And with that big club in its tail, I'm sure he would keep predators away. Maybe he could knock a tree down. I don't know. Even though these things are gone, we can study their fossils. Bruce mentioned this morning, the big thing inside some of these bones, they're finding blood vessels and things. I'm not sure what they're finding in Ankylosaur, but in that bony protrusion at the end of its tail, they can look at that closely. Even though it's been mostly converted to rocks and minerals, they can see what that big bump was like. And it turns out that it was rather lightweight, but very strong. That is the bony protrusion on the tail that it has. So I was working with some little kids, and we had some Play-Doh. And so I said, let's see if we can make a kind of a copy of the tail of this Ankylosaur. Because when they look at the kind of fibers it had in its tail, it was fibers going this way, and this way, and this way. They were kind of stacked up. And so we were doing that with Play-Doh. You know, that's kind of the way they make plywood. They have different wood layers going different directions, and it makes them very strong. And this is kind of an analogy of what that tail of that Ankylosaur was like. Lightweight, but very strong. In fact, some of our, our armored vests or bulletproof vests, they use this kind of thing where you have that type of protection. Anyway, that picture kind of reminded me of things like fiberglass. Not that that came from the dinosaurs, but the dinosaurs had it in the first place. Again, nothing is simple in nature. Everything is just complex beyond what we can imagine. So there's another challenge, once again, to mutation and natural selection over time. Whenever these dinosaurs showed up, they were well designed from the start. By the way, when creationists think dinosaurs came along on day number 6, when all the land animals showed up. We got to fit a dog into the picture. This is another classic story. It does go back to the 1930s, so we're almost 100 years ago. Out on the East Coast was a fellow by the name of Paul Speary, and he liked to go sailing on the weekends. You know, East Coast. And back then, the 1920s and 30s, there was a problem. You got this sailboat, and then it gets wet from the spray, and then it gets slippery, and you can fall and hurt yourself. And it's just something that they lived with. Well, during the winter time, Paul Speary was out walking his dog. It wasn't sailing season, it was just winter time. And they were walking down this icy sidewalk. And Paul was slipping and sliding, but he noticed his dog was just sure-footed, padding along on the ice. He didn't slide. And he thought, well, that's interesting. When they got back home, Paul looked at the paw of his dog. I think it was a Cocker Spaniel. And you know what a dog paw looks like. They're separate little pads. And with some dogs, when you look at the pad, there's like fingerprints. There's little grooves in it. Well, Paul thought, okay, maybe that's an idea. So Paul Speary took a piece of rubber membrane, and he wrapped it around his shoe, and he cut some grooves in it. And he went outside and walked on the ice, and the traction was instant. He didn't fall then. He came up with the idea of putting tread on a shoe. That hadn't been done before. So he sold that idea to the U.S. Navy, of course, millions of shoes, and the athletic world. Well, most shoes have this tread on them today. And that idea, he says, came by looking at the paw of his dog, who was designed with that in the first place. That company, by the way, that Paul Speary started is still in business. He's passed away now. And they have one famous makeup shoe called a Speary Topsider. I'm not into sailing, but I don't know. Have you heard of this shoe before? I mean, it's not a cheap shoe, but it's a quality one, and that company's still going. You might look up the Speary company. And in fact, there's a little biography on the homepage of that company showing, telling the story about how the dog led to the whole formation of the whole thing. Well, thank you, dog, for that whole idea. And so again, a picture of a Speary Topsider and the zigzag pattern that is everywhere now. Well, it's even on car tires. Apparently up to that time in the 1930s, that just wasn't done for shoes, but it sure is now. Hey, we're moving along here. Hang on, we've got just a few more to look at. I thought along with plants and animals, we ought to mention ourselves. So how about the origin of the intermittent windshield wiper? Now this comes from the state of Michigan, actually. Let's see, this fellow's name, Paul Kearns. He lived in Detroit, and back in the 60s, you know, cars, Detroit, windshield wipers had, I think, probably 2 speeds, low or fast, or off. And you know how on a day when it's just kind of misty, with an old-fashioned windshield wiper like that, it's kind of an irritation. The thing chatters, it makes noises, it's either going too fast or too slow. And this fellow got to thinking, why do we have this trouble with our windshield wiper when our eye works just fine? It blinks whenever it's needed to keep your eye moist. You know, it just happens. And so in this early day, back in the 60s, he came up with a gear mechanism that could adjust this windshield wiper to really slow it down so that it would go every, 2 or 3 or 4 seconds or whatever. We all got it in our cars now. You can, how fast it is. But that was brand new back then. And it was a new idea. In fact, Detroit wouldn't even believe him that he could do it that way, that he could slow it down to the speeds we have today. Well, it's in all the cars today, the way these windshield wipers work, thanks to this guy. There was a whole movie made about this. I don't know if this resonates with any of you. And there was a big controversy because the Detroit car makers didn't want to reward him for coming up with the idea, and it went on, and I don't know how it all ended up, but that's part of the whole story. Yeah, this thing that we all have today, it's modeled after the way our eye works. That's how the idea came to him on a sort of a damp type day. So anyway, thanks Bob Kearns for that idea. Somebody Michigander from days gone by. Here's something else from our own body. A femur. Looks like an old classic drawing there that I found. This is the largest bone in our body. It's right down here, kind of our upper leg bone, and it kind of fits into our hip. And I notice at the top it has this ball and socket. Boy, that thing doesn't look like it's designed very well. Look how that ball is off to the side. Looks like you could just break that right off. Of course, that can happen. You can have hip problems. But it's very strong. That works very well. With this kind of thing, you can squat, you can run, you can move around. It's the way our femur is designed. Well, the story this time, 100 years ago, there was an architect. And he was thinking of ideas on how to make a new structure, a new building. In fact, there was a competition to come up with a new design. And this architect had a friend who was a medical doctor. And it was a slow day, maybe a Saturday afternoon, and they were sitting in the office, and this doctor had a femur on his desk. And so the architect picked it up, and he was looking at this thing. He thought, that's an interesting way it's kind of curved and tapered on the top. Architects are into design and math. And then he took this femur, and he, in his mind, turned it upside down so that the ball was at the bottom, and the side was kind of tapering out like this. And he thought, can I design a building that has sort of a slanted base? By the way, this guy's name was Gustav Eiffel. And this was the 1880s. There was a world exposition over in Paris, and the competition was to build a new building. And so he got the award, along with some other buildings, to put this up. So along came, of course, the Eiffel Tower. That's what we're talking about. And when this thing went up, the other architects said, what an ugly thing this is. You're going to use bare metal? It'll probably collapse under its own weight, they said. But he put it up. And here we are 100 and some years later. Most of the other buildings are gone from that era. But the Eiffel Tower still stands, one of the most popular attractions, for tourists in Europe. And in his diary, this guy, Eiffel, says he got the idea by studying the way our femur is designed for that tapered base. It's interesting, even the little ligaments inside that ball or bone are copied in some of the metal braces inside this building. He copied lots of it, and there it still is. It looks to me like we're surrounded by design. Hang on, we're getting close to the end here. Here's one from the non-living world. Everything I've been talking about so far are things that had some life in them. Well, there's one kind of a star called a pulsar. It winks at you. It blinks off and on. They're also called neutron stars. Actually, they're spinning real fast, and they have a hot spot on them, so every time it comes around, you see a flash of that light. Some of them flash once per minute. Some of them flash 10 times per second. Some of them flash 600 times per second. This is an interesting small collapsed star that's spinning like crazy. It almost reminds me of these lights we have in the ceiling here in our auditorium. Those are fluorescent lights. They're actually blinking, probably about 60 times a second. But they're blinking so fast you can't see that. Sometimes out of the corner of your eye you can catch a little blinking if you haven't seen these lights for a while. Well, that's what these pulsars are like, most of them. They just look like they're on, but they're blinking so rapidly you can't tell. And most of them are not visible anyway. They're the other types of light, but they're studied. There's hundreds of these pulsars in our own Milky Way galaxy. These things are so regular when they're flashing. This article, 2004, says that they are ultra-stable clocks. These days, we need very precise clocks. You need it for GPS. You need it for your own laptop, down to the nanosecond or gigasecond or whatever. And of course, we have atomic clocks and things like that. Well, these stars are just as precise or more so than an atomic clock. These stars are showing up to be very useful as a very close time standard. This is some of the pulsar signals. I don't know what the time scale is, how rapidly they're coming as the star spins. Now, this is an interesting one. When you get into Scripture, Genesis says that stars were made to be for signs and seasons and days and years and time. Today we're finding out, yes, these stars are good for time. They're a time standard. They're competing with our molecular, our atomic clocks. I like that idea. This again challenges mutation and natural selection. Remember that typical cop-out? Because these things, they don't mutate. They don't naturally select. They've just been around since the start. I think it's the way the Creator made it in the first place. And finally we realized, yeah, there's a use for these stars, a time standard. Let me just mention one last area here. This might go off the deep end, but in mathematics as well, we're finding lots of useful design. All the world of math, look at all the crazy symbols here. So anyway, just let me mention a few of these possibilities. Remember an ellipse, the egg-shaped orbit of a planet, or the shape of an egg for that matter? Well, you know, the mathematics of an ellipse was figured out way back in BC times. The Greeks, they did a lot of math back then. And there was an instant it just sat. And then much later, in the 1600s, Kepler realized that's just the math that we need to describe the orbit of planets or moons or anything. Anything in orbit follows this elliptical shape. If you get what I'm saying there, the math was done long ago, and then it was much later realized that math is in nature, and it fits a later discovery. Here's another one. Ever seen this on a t-shirt? These are called Maxwell's equations, Clerk Maxwell. This is pretty high-tech stuff. Those are differential equations on that shirt. We don't have to go there this morning, but it's wonderful stuff. Anyway, he worked out these formulas in the 1860s and published it. And people said, that's interesting, but what does it all mean? Well, about 20 years later, then radio waves were discovered, and they fit exactly these formulas. He came up with the math before we found it in nature. This happens over and over again. I think it shows that math is the language of creation, and it just kind of leads the way. It's just more intelligent planning. I just put in a couple more here. The whole field of mathematics called matrices or determinants. That's kind of a fun area in math. It was done back in the 1850s. Well, it's been found to be most useful today for design of aircraft wings. It just kind of sat there for a long time. What do you do with this stuff? And then they realized, yep, this applies to nature. And there's Boolean algebra. That's the digital stuff. That's the binary, the ones and the zeros. Come way back in the 1800s. And people said, you know, what are you doing messing with ones and zeros? What's binary? Well, it's today, isn't it? All of our solid-state electronics, digital electronics involves that stuff. It just, the math was found 100 years before its time. Math seems to lead the way in new discoveries. Here's a classic article. You can find this if you just put in a couple words on Google. He wrote the unreasonable effectiveness of math in describing the natural sciences. It's just there. It's more intelligent design, these patterns in nature. I think that's good stuff, and math continues to lead the way. By the way, if you want to do more with this stuff, just another commercial. You can see I kind of have a real interest in these designs in nature. And just 3 or 4 years ago, I came out with this book with a colleague of mine. We called it Discovery of Design. And this book is available on Amazon. It's a paperback. And in there we put about 60 of these examples of design in nature. And we've also started a website. There's at the top of the slide, and there we have hundreds more of these examples. Again, as I mentioned first thing this morning, I think it's a whole new paradigm of science. Studying nature to see what the Creator put there for us to find and make use of. It's all kind of rather exciting. And by the way, there's a place on that website to kind of write in yourself. So if you come up with a new idea, if you see one in the literature or in your textbooks or whatever, I appreciate you shoot it to me. And what I do is I kind of summarize these things and add it to that data bank that we're putting on that website. Design in nature. It's been a fun project for us. I think that's the end of my example. And you can see they would go on all day, but having just a few of them there, I'll just leave that up there for a minute. Have I triggered any ideas in your mind? Anybody got another example? Anybody want to challenge one of these things?
Before you jump into Q&A, and you've left about half an hour, I appreciate that. You're going to leave for lunch after this. I think I forgot to mention, you do need to be here for the final session to win the iPad. It's from 4:30 to 5. So more fascinating stuff after lunch.
Okay.
But I just want to make sure people clearly
You must be present to win.
You've got to be present to win. Okay, thank you.
I hope one of you guys win. You stick around today. You've probably heard of this one before on Velcro, because that's been around a long time, and there are so many more now that are kind of interesting. Really, do any other ones come to mind, any examples, or any comments on any of this? Yes, sir.
One question I have is, are there examples of unsophisticated design things? We talk about evolution things and things getting more complex or interesting, and are there examples of non-complex organisms in nature? Or is everything really so designed? I guess the question is, if you argue that things evolve, they're more complicated, they go like more, as like you said earlier with the fossils, you have a very sophisticated design very early on. So are there examples? So I would imagine that some things are more complicated than others, but it seems to me there's fine design in everything. So I guess are there examples of things that are not?
Are there examples of
Of
simple things?
Yeah, simple things.
Good question.
That are not.
I can't think of any in the living world. Plants, animals, anything you want to talk about. If there's a living cell there, there's more than we can imagine. But let's say, thinking about something that's said to be simple, how about a grain of salt? Sodium chloride, which just has sodium and chlorine atoms lined up one after another, you know, like a band of formation. That would probably be said to be a simple crystal, although it's not simple. Because what makes that salt grain, what makes those atoms pull together? Well, that's either ionic or covalent bonding. There's chemistry there. And of course, inside those atoms, there's electrons. They're in orbits. We're finding out that electrons are non-localized. They're spread out. You can go as far as you want with this stuff. I think you make a good question. I think maybe one could maintain that there is nothing simple in nature. In fact, everything is beyond what we can even imagine. You know, these designs, all of these, either were microscopic or macro. What is going on inside a living cell? What kind of designs are there way down there in inner layers that we haven't even seen or touched on? What can we learn from that? What maybe was programmed in there for us to make use of? We haven't begun to explore the micro or nano scale of nature. So you got me. I'm going to say there's nothing simple.
What about like the paper clip?
A paper clip. Well, that's relatively simple. We buy a whole box of them for under $1, I guess, you know. Or should we go there and say, what's the paper clip made out of? Iron atoms, you know, 26 electrons, and yeah. Certainly on the larger scale, yeah, you could say that. It's probably the living world which is most impressive. Now that's not my world, I'm more into physics, but I guess that's why I'm going way low down. Okay, a paper clip is simple. Some of them are.
Now the Wright brothers, did they study anything from design to come up with
The Wright brothers. Certainly, they studied birds, they studied bird flight, they had rough wind tunnels they put up. That was certainly part of their whole system, I think. I remember reading an article about Intermittent and studying hawks. But then they kind of, you know, went the long way with lightweight. Even the tubing in their early planes were hollow tubing, and bird bones are hollow. So I'm not sure just how much copying they did. But boy, flight is a big area of planes copying things that are flying around us. You know, these drones, these unmanned, they're copying dragonflies. Dragonflies, you know, with 4 wings, fly upside down, backward, forward. They are masters of flight. They're being looked at to see if we can duplicate that. Yes, sir.
If you were an evolutionist, what formula would you offer for design?
What formula would I offer?
Yeah, time, random chance. What makes design in evolution?
Well, the phrases that I was using when it comes to living things, they would say that somehow life spontaneously started, and then mutations, whether that's chemicals or heat or radiation or whatever, can change the offspring of that critter, whatever it was. And the ones that are better adapted, the ones that are stronger, maybe can have more offspring, they're the ones that are going to take over. That whole idea of mutation and natural selection, I mean, it is an interesting story they tell, how things then evolve and climb up the ladder. But the fact is, as we look at it in the laboratory, mutations, they're mistakes. They make things worse. Now, I'm down close to Notre Dame down there in South Bend, and they have a whole building dedicated to mosquitoes. They're mutating those things. They're trying to study them for malaria and all that. And they keep zapping these mosquitoes, and they haven't made a super mosquito. Every time they do this, it gets worse. They get their wings go away, or they get too heavy or whatever. It looks like a mosquito is already optimum. And whenever they try to mutate these things, they go downhill. Same thing happens with fruit flies. That's a common study. So it's like mutation doesn't really work. I guess natural selection, that's more understandable to me. If you have some different critters, whatever was the best suited would be the one that lives on. But mutation seems to be a weak link.
Well, you're basically dealing with chance or random events and the destruction of DNA, aren't you?
I think so, yes. Yes, chance with a low probability.
Chance creates design.
Now, you do ask about formulas, and again, that's my world of physics, F equals ma, and the gravity equation. I look at all of these physics books, and they describe the formulas of nature, and do examples with them. But the books are not very good at saying where these formulas came from in the first place. What is the origin of the law of gravity or conservation of energy? Why do we have these laws, these natural laws that govern this whole universe and make the whole place dependable? Physics just says that's not our concern. We're just working with equations. There's something about these laws themselves that are maybe the top design to talk about. There are rules that were put in place for nature. Of course, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Yes, sir.
So first of all, I'd like to say that I like to talk because it just shows there's so much diversity in nature, which is really fascinating. I'd just like to challenge maybe one of the things that you just said about mutations. So I study plants, and I'm looking at how secondary metabolites are made in plants. I specifically look at tomatoes, and the example, so tomato, the original variety of tomato that was grown in South America was, the fruit was small, like cherry tomatoes, and now we have got a big fruit, and we can show that that's because of mutation in a single gene. So mutations are not necessarily bad. You can also get mutations that result in big fruit. In the case of corn, Teosinte, which was the variety that was grown in South America, in Mexico, that doesn't produce as many tillers, but single mutation in a single gene actually gave us the maize that we have right now, and it's really helping us feed the population. Now, having said that, regarding your talk, I was just wondering, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that this is really intelligent design by some creator, and the other way would be these things are there here, and it just tells us about the brilliance of the human mind, the way human mind works, that we can go into the nature, find things that we really need, and make uses of those things for human purposes. So I'm just curious to know how you distinguish between these two viewpoints, these two perspectives.
Thank you for your example. You're talking about a fruit, that they made a larger one, the first thing you said. But is it the same fruit?
It's the same fruit.
Same fruit.
Yeah, I mean, I can get into the specific species too, but and I can talk about the genes, but yeah.
You know, in the creation worldview, we're not going to say that nothing changes. The very word evolution means change, and things are changing all the time. But we would maintain that there are some limits to this change. You could use the word micro changes or macro changes. Yes, you could develop different kinds of fruit, and that's done all the time in health, but the bananas stay bananas and such. I think that when creation took place, there was potential put there for variation within the kinds, and things do vary. And we don't know what the word kind was either, how broad this is. So things do change in nature, but the dogs stay dogs, the cats stay cats, the bananas stay bananas. There are some limits. And a lot of small changes, micro changes, don't lead to a macro change. You hit the wall after a while of how much things can change. In the creation viewpoint, we are not opposed to new species developing. Speciation occurs all the time. But that's, you know, a species, something that can interbreed and reproduce, but that really makes a limit. That kind of puts that off in a different category by itself. What we don't end up with something macroscopic, something brand new. I would challenge you folks to Google and find examples for positive mutations. I've tried this. Now, you're kind of describing them in a different size of a fruit, but you don't find much. There's just not much there. And yet, if this is the way it happens, mutation and natural selection, there should be endless, there should be trillions of examples. But there seems to be a paucity, a lack of those in, at least when I try to Google. Try that, see if you can find any positive mutations. See what they say about it. Yes, ma'am.
For positive mutations and how you're stipulating that they generally aren't positive for the organism that's having mutations, how do you feel about antibiotic-resistant bacteria? Because the mutations, the variation amongst the bacteria are making it less susceptible.
Yep, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, the AIDS virus keeps mutating, and they have to have different medicines for it. But as I look at this, the AIDS virus is still an AIDS virus. So it's mutating, it's changing somewhat, but it's not a macroscopic, it's not changing into something completely different. That'd be my take on it. But certainly that kind of change occurs all the time, and it's something to keep up with. Yes?
So you said that it's actually, when you're talking about, I think you called it microevolution?
Micro or macro?
And you said that it is possible for like a species to mutate into another species. Is that what you were saying earlier? But like, so if you said that species can change to a different species, isn't that by definition macroevolution, but you're defining it as microevolution?
I guess the definition goes, what do you mean by micro or macro? Of course, the very definition of species is not spelled out that clearly. In
The definition of species is when the two creatures are different enough that they can't reproduce with each other and have offspring that can reproduce themselves.
That's one definition. Yeah.
That's the definition.
I'm just saying most creationists today are not opposed to speciation, new species. How about an example of Darwin's finches down there in the Galapagos? I would suggest that at creation there was a species kind of finch that was created, a male and a female. And from that today we have a dozen or more species of these finches. I think they can spread out that much, but they're still finches. And I know it gets a little nebulous, well, where do you go from micro to macro? But there's some kind of jump there. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I was just curious. Sometimes we mix up things where, are you getting increased complexity? And the reality is it seems like there's a fundamental difference between micro and macro in the sense of, are you putting something that was there that wasn't there? That's why they've been using mutation for 100 years, and it's pretty much, the advantages almost cause more detriments than advantages. For instance, malaria, you can stop it with sickle cell anemia, but the cure is worse than the fix. And I guess that's the problem, is like, are you really adding something that wasn't there before? To get an amphibian to be a reptile, you have to have something that was there that wasn't there before. and it's got to be a fundamental different creature. And of course the problem is you have, like say, the biblical word for kind is different than species. You're mixing certain things together, and it does get nebulous. It just does get a little bit tricky. But to add something that wasn't there, you don't see that ever happening. You just can't. You just don't. Mutation doesn't really add anything. It may oftentimes antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Yes, they can get rid of the antibiotics, but they actually, it's because their nutrient absorption is worse. Okay, they've lost the ability to absorb the poison for the same reason they've lost the ability to absorb food. But you put them out in the natural world. I asked doctors about this one time, and they said, you know, yeah, go out and roll around in the dirt. They're being a little facetious, but the point is you want to get rid of antibiotics, close the hospital down, let the regular bacteria come in there, and they'll all compete for food sources. They'll die off, okay? You're never going to get that to happen, and that may be as simplistic, but a lot of that is the case. The cure and the actual mutation has deleted information. It has not added something. It's really trashed it a little bit. But in certain environments, it works better. For instance, a mutation that causes a wing to disappear on an island that's heavily windy would be an advantage for that creature, so that's beneficial in that sense. But you haven't added information. You've actually deleted information. Darwin didn't know about any of this stuff, and that's the problem, that it gets more and more and more complex the farther down we go. We keep seeing micro and mini machines, I mean, it's just unbelievable how it does that. And so we're conflating things together. Where does it begin? I go, well, there are lines, we can just see them. I mean, even in the regular biological world, that there's just a difference between a reptile and an amphibian, even between a bird and a mammal, and those never get bridged. That just does not happen. When you talked about limits, that's what I'm looking at, these limits. And then you say, well, where are those limits? Speciation is one thing, but a different kind is a total different thing. You know, that's where I would come on that. So, you know.
Yeah, another thing too is like the definition that species is something that can interbreed and then produce fertile offspring is a extremely broad definition, and the actual definition in like organismal biology is much more narrow because there are blurred lines in between that definition. That definition is not narrow enough. For example, ring species, where there's like a geographic, like kind of like around a mountain or something, and there's a certain, like a slow change across a species, and it eventually gets to a point where the beginning and the end can't reproduce, but like they're very connected to where like this species can interbreed with this species, the next one can interbreed with other twos, but then like the two that they can interbreed can't interbreed together. And so to like when we're talking about speciation, I think we should realize that the definition that it's strictly interbreeding is not the actual definition that's used, especially when using like endangered species. It's a lot of like phenotypic traits, stuff like that, to where it's much more complex, and it's widely debated in today's society, especially when it comes to like the economics of endangered species and stuff like that, how the protection affects industries and stuff. So to have that definition is like not specific enough to what we use today.
One more thought before we end. I'm just holding this feather that we had. You know, the common assumption is that scales frayed into feathers, and that's how flight originated. And so I'm looking at this feather with remember that Velcro, the little hooks and eyelets? That would be a macro change if a scale could turn into a feather, and that would be predicted in the fossil record, but it's not there. The early birds that we find, like Archaeopteryx, completely designed feathers. They look just like this, aerodynamically designed. As far back as we look, birds have this kind of feather, and fish have different kinds of scales. We still have a lot to learn about the fossil record, but it doesn't back up a lot of these assumptions that are made. It's easy to say scales frayed into feathers. That makes a great story, but it's just a model. It's not necessarily reality. Okay, thanks for coming today.
Could you repeat again what you're going to talk about this afternoon in astronomy?
Well, yeah, we have some different talks. I think I just titled it Today's Astronomy. Just some current events. I'll talk about the search for life in space and look at the Drake equation. We'll look at studies of the moon, our nearest neighbor, to see if they figured out its origin. And it turns out that the moon, I think, challenges the age of the solar system. We'll look a little bit at galaxies and see a #1 problem in astronomy today, missing matter. So we're just going to go down the line and look at some of the current topics in space stuff and have some pictures to go with it. Hey, thanks for coming today, folks. Thanks for your questions. We're all still working on answers to this, and it's an exciting study. Have a good day around here. If anyone wants to CRS brochure, your side, help us out.